knowledge sharing series. In this part of the PIBF Islamic Finance knowledge sharing series, we will be covering Sukuk, the structure of a Sukuk, how it's structured, what are the different types of Sukuks, and we'll cover what are the future trends in Islamic finance, specifically in Islamic capital markets. So the Sukuk tries to replicate the payment schedule of a conventional bond. A Sukuk should never be called an Islamic version of a bond, because a bond is based on a riba, which is obviously Sharia non-permissible. What you do is with the Sukuk, you try to replicate the payment schedule of a bond. So like a bond, what happens is you pay the principal, then you get some biannual or annual or whatever payment, and at the end of the tenor, your principal is redeemed. Now the principal, depending on the structure of the Sukuk, can depend if it's what you paid in the beginning or is it linked to the market value of the underlying asset and so on and so forth. That will be discussed later, but that is a simple payment structure of how a Sukuk is used to replicate a conventional bond. So a Sukuk is structured using a process called securitization. In securitization, what happens is you, as an entity who's looking for financing, you take or identify a revenue generating asset or a business opportunity or a business division, and you set up an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. Through the SPV, you sell that to Sukuk holders, and any income generated by that asset is attributable to the Sukuk holders. At the end of that tenor, you buy back that asset or entity or whatever that income generating instrument will be. Sukuks are structured using Islamic financial contracts. Just to give you a brief example, for example, if we use the contract of Ijara, Islamic financial contract of Ijara, which is again a lease contract, as we've told in the previous knowledge sharing series. Now what happens is that we have this asset as an entity, I need financing. I have an asset which is revenue generating. I sell it to the Sukuk holders via the SPV, and now the ownership lies with the Sukuk holders. The SPV obviously takes care of the asset and all the legal responsibilities, but the end owners are the Sukuk holders. Now what happens is I lease back as an entity, I lease back that asset from the Sukuk holders, and I pay the lease rental on that asset. So that will be the payment yearly or biannual payment that goes to the Sukuk holders. And at the end of the tenor, what I do as an entity, I buy back my asset from the Sukuk holders. So I filled the gap of liquidity that I needed, and at the end of the tenor, I also own or buy back the asset. Obviously, there's some financial contracts around which revolve around this process. For example, there's a buyback clause. There's that as Sukuk holder, I cannot sell as Sukuk holders. In fact, I cannot sell this asset to a third party, and so on and so forth. But this is in general an example of an Ijara Sukuk. There are other structures as well. There's a Mudaraba or Musharaka structure, which is a partnership-based model. There's a Murabaha structure, which is mostly used, and we do come to that later on. But that's a brief overview of how Sukuks are structured. So when it comes to Sukuk tradability, according to IOFI standards, now IOFI is the accounting and auditing organization for Islamic financial institutions, which is the major standard setting body for Islamic financial institutions around the world. Some Sukuks are tradable, while others are not. For example, any Sukuk that represents ownership of a real asset can be traded. You can sell off an asset. Any Sukuk that represents debt cannot be traded, because in Islam, tradability of debt is not allowed. So for example, I mentioned the Ijara structure earlier. In an Ijara structure, your Sukuk represents ownership of that asset. In that type of Sukuk, you can trade it. Even when it comes to a Mudaraba or Musharaka partnership Sukuk model structure, if the underlying portfolio represents more than 50% of that is represented by real assets rather than cash or debt, then that can be traded. If obviously the portfolio represents cash or debt, it cannot be traded. So these are some of the, according to IOFI standards, some of the tradability rules when it comes to Sukuk. So according to the IIFM Sukuk report of 2020, which tells about the industry in 2019. 2019 saw a record year when it came to Sukuk issuances. There were about 145 billion plus worth of Sukuk issuances in 2019, and most of them were sovereign or quasi-sovereign Sukuk. If I'm to project for 2020 how the market is, I think because of a lot of reasons, majority of it related to COVID and how the situation was, I would assume that even 2020 would show a much better Sukuk issuance performance compared to 2019, and maybe the trend will continue, going into 2021. And one of the reasons is there are a lot of deficits governments have faced over the past due to the prevailing circumstances. So to fill that gap of foreign direct investment or for infrastructure projects as well, some infrastructure project requirement, a lot of governments will look to issue Sukuk, or will look at the capital markets, and especially Muslim countries will look to the Sukuk market or Sukuks to issue. In 2019, not only Muslim countries, a lot of Muslim countries, non-Muslim countries, also non-Muslim majority countries, also looked towards the Sukuk market to attract FDI, foreign direct investment. For example, we have Japan, we have Taiwan, but historically we've seen UK, Luxembourg, Germany, Singapore, all of these countries have leveraged off the Sukuk market to attract FDI or for infrastructure projects as well. When we talk about the future trends of the Sukuk or Islamic capital markets, one of the things that faces the global Islamic finance industry, not just the Sukuk market, is how do we position Islamic finance as a global value proposition? It's done over the past 40 years of its existence. Islamic finance has done fairly well in Muslim countries. Obviously, acceptance could be better, but it has proven to be a viable banking model, yes, for Muslim countries. Now, the future trend should be, or one of the challenges I would say for the global Islamic finance industry is how do you present it as a global value proposition for Muslims and non-Muslims alike? Because as we've said many times before, Islamic finance is not just for Muslims. It's a form of finance which is ethical in nature and is accessible or open for all. And that's where I want to come in. I want to address, that's the element I want to address, which is Islamic finance can leverage off its ethical nature. So Islamic finance obviously promotes risk sharing, equitability, ethical investment. So anything that is harmful for society cannot be invested in, for example, alcohol, tobacco, and so on and so forth. So there is a ethical value proposition. Now, another trend we see is that a lot of countries, Muslims and non-Muslim countries, have signed up to something called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These goals include, facilitating, greenery, sustainability, or alleviating poverty, and so on and so forth. Inclusiveness, So these goals are for the betterment of society. And Islamic finance fits in perfectly and can be leveraged. Islamic finance can leverage both the UN Sustainability Goal, UN Sustainable SDGs, and as well as its ethical nature to truly give a global value proposition to not only, like I said, Muslims, but also non-Muslims. So if we look at Muslim countries now, if you look at the map of financial inclusion, financial inclusion means people or the percentage of the population that has access to financial services. So for example, what percentage of as a country, what percentage of your population has access to a savings account or can access financing? If you look at the financial inclusion global map, you would see, unfortunately, the countries with the lowest amount of financial inclusion will be mostly Muslim majority countries. So this is something that needs to be addressed. How will this be addressed, or how should this be addressed, especially using Sukuk? Well, one of the other interesting things that's been happening in finance, it's a very interesting time to be in the finance field, is the rise of fintech, financial technology. And we've seen this happen in non-Muslim and non-Islamic way as well, where you've seen people funding SMEs or small entrepreneurs using crowdfunding, something called crowdfunding, where you'll have 1,000 people paying $1 or $2 each and funding a business activity. And this is not charitable. This can be ethical because it's promoting inclusion, but it's not like a charity. You will get a return on it, but instead of your exposure is expanded. Instead of one or two people paying $1,000 towards a business activity, you've got like 100 people paying $1, $2, $3, or $10, whatever the amount is. So this is something that can be done. Something called a retail sukuk or a crowdfunded sukuk using technology is something that Islamic finance or fintechs which are coming into Islamic finance should seriously consider. Again, if you look at Muslim countries, I'm talking about financial inclusion, but even the businesses, majority of the businesses in Muslim countries are small or medium enterprises, SMEs. So again, they can leverage off these solutions as well. So this is where I think one or two major areas, there can be more, where the trend should or is headed in Islamic finance. Islamic finance and the Sukuk capital markets are ripe for disruption, as are conventional financial markets, and that's where we see the future headed.